Welcome to Grub and Grace. I'm Mark Flower. Just like last week, I'm going to be starting off with a little dialogue with myself before I jump into the episode. I heard some feedback that it might be helpful to have a little disclaimer before I jump into this. Some people were a little confused as it's a little bit of a different format than what I typically do. So here we go. Karl Barth, a Swiss Reformed theologian, had a great influence on Dietrich Bonhoeffer's teachings. Barth recognized that if we don't let God be God and tell us who God is through the cross-dead Christ, we give to God our own image, our own desires, our own prejudice, our own desire for power, for prestige, and possessions, and we render on the other responsibility for anything that makes us uncomfortable, anything that's a challenge for us, and anything that generates fear. 1930s German economy was devastated from World War I. So when a passionate activist spoke in a language that resonated with the downtrodden German people, he inevitably rose to prominence. Hitler positioned himself as the voice of the common man, railing on elites and the establishment. However, his messages were interspliced with xenophobia and fear-based rhetoric like cultural degenerates, scapegoating minorities and marginalized folks for the nation's problems, exploiting societal divisions as us versus them, and labeling anyone outside of his party as Marxists. Once he became chancellor in 1933, he appointed German oligarchs as economic advisors, privatized government utilities, shut down workers' unions and any strikes, and continued to remove rights of minorities. The Nazis collected any books promoting degeneracy or woke today and held large book burnings. Berlin had a thriving LGBT community and the very first transgender clinic, but the Nazis burned that down. And with the revision of paragraph 175A, they criminalized homosexuality, and LGBT people were sent to concentration camps and forced to wear triangle badges. The Nazis were also threatened by independent women, so Hitler proclaimed, "A woman's world is her husband, her family, her children, her house." And this is all said while women's reproductive rights are being rolled back and any doctors who performed an abortion face the death penalty. They removed citizenship rights for Jews and started to round them up for mass deportations for being illegally in the country. The German press even highlighted a few instances of violence to convince the public that Jewish people were the real threat to real Germans. Hitler became a billionaire, and his posse of oligarchs knew that they could get away with a scam if they constantly had an enemy within to blame, while the corporatocracy robbed the country blind. Loyalty wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. Opponents were silenced, and the media dare not criticize him. There were only a few who stood up against all adversity. You wouldn't be remiss to think that this sounds eerily similar to what's happening today. Widespread immigration raids, removing birthright citizenship, federal government employees having to prove their mega revelation, freezing all federal grants for social programs, and 4 states considering bills allowing conviction of women who have an abortion or even a miscarriage as murder. White Christian nationalism under a Trump presidency has certainly been turning heads and drawing critics, even within their own party. So you might be asking yourself, well, is white Christian nationalism really the issue though? Yes and no. Where Christian nationalism is problematic to a very large degree, the weaponization of it is a convenient pawn and a symptom of much larger systemic issues. Xenophobia, racism, and creating complacency are just some of the tools used to maintain wealth, power, and control. These tools are used to divide and limit the working class's ability to effectively and collectively organize, as well as distracting us with scapegoats to take our attention away from deeper-rooted issues. Looking specifically at white Christian nationalism, much of today's theological belief system is just as much about culture, which can be seen through celebrated heroes such as John Wayne, General Douglas MacArthur, and George Patton. The image of the strong, masculine, all-American cowboy or the idealized soldier have become the stereotype of Christian men. As ironic as it is for picking someone like John Wayne as a moral Christian hero, they were picked to symbolize a different set of values that would initiate emotional, nostalgic, mythical values. a return to gender roles, and a reassertion of white patriarchal authority. During the 60s, preachers like Billy Graham became very deeply intertwined with politics, heavily involving himself with the likes of Reagan while pushing muscular Christianity. In her book, Jesus and John Wayne, Kristen Kobes-Demez explains, "To Graham, Jesus was no sissy. He was a star athlete that could become your life's hero. Christian life was total war, and Jesus was our great commander." Dumais notes how the sexual revolution and the loss in the Vietnam War facilitated the entrenchment of evangelical siege mentality by undermining the natural order that God had ordained between the sexes, and for America's role in the fight against godless communism. This continued to gain traction through the 70s and 80s with prominent figures such as Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network, Phyllis Schlafly's successful war against the equal rights movement, and Jerry Falwell's creation of the moral majority. We have seen the reaction within many church communities, condemning those asking for mercy and empathy on the marginalized and the immigrant. Many have even spoken about the sin of empathy. We see a section of the population that is okay with changing the definition of words and creating narratives that weren't already there. Biblically speaking, there is no mention of the sin of empathy, nor are there any decrees in the Bible for power or dominion. In fact, Jesus harshly rebuked the seeking of power and wealth and criticized those with blatant outward piety. Making up narratives, such as the sin of empathy is a woke, leftist tool, only exposes their discomfort when confronted with ideologies that are contrary to their belief. We see this with Jonah in his discomfort when he says he'd be better off dead when God forgives the Ninevites. It is okay to feel discomfort. Discomfort allows us to sit and challenge our preconceived dogmas and wrestle with them. It is within this discomfort that leads us to the cross. When Jesus calls us to take up our cross, what does that look like to you? Does it look like feeding the hungry, welcoming the stranger, loving our neighbor, sheltering the homeless, comforting the sick, or visiting those in prison? Or is there a complacent apathy, condemning those who attempt to seek the goodness of Christ? Bonhoeffer very famously talks about stupidity. He says, "Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy to good than malice. Against stupidity, we are defenseless. Reasons fall on deaf ears. Facts that contradict one's prejudgment simply need not be believed." Bonhoeffer isn't just talking about ignorance. He's talking about a willful refusal to think critically, question, or engage with reason. Without self-reflection on our dogmas, lies and harmful ideas persist without challenge. Bonhoeffer has an answer to this when he says, "If we want to know how to get the better of stupidity, we must seek to understand its nature. It is not an intellectual defect, but a human one. There are human beings who are of remarkable agile intellect, but stupid, and others who are intellectually quite dull, but anything but stupid. We have a responsibility to hold our friends, our neighbors, our family accountable while encouraging critical thinking, questioning inwardly, and engage with reason. That means asking the difficult questions, holding ourselves accountable, and open to personal growth. It's not easy, but it's necessary, especially in a world where apathy can feel like a safer and more comfortable choice. Are we willing to be courageous and wrestle with the discomfort? Are we committed to being more present to those around us and to build a world that reflects God's goodness?
Yeah, and you did mention that if you know anybody within these groups like Black Lives Matter movements, and when you get people like women who were impacted by the rollback of Roe v. Wade, and women that were impacted that several states had, it went back to states' rights, and certain states had basically rolled back that women couldn't get, abortions, and they would pretty much have to drive out of state, and figure out some other way, or just deal with the pregnancy, even if it was harmful to the woman herself. And there was a lot of women that were deeply impacted by that. And if you are around people that were impacted by that, and you get an actual genuine response as to what they went through, how they processed it emotion wise and physically, and like everything like that, you allow that relational space to have the person be honest with you and hear these stories, being impacted by policies, by the racism that they've encountered. I just talked to someone that growing up, he would have like things thrown in his head. He would have people beat him just because he was black, and so he deal with racism on a very, very literal manner, with physical violence. Wow. And when you start talking to people like that, you start to see the holes through some of this rhetoric and some of this trying to push of certain things, that it kind of takes you out of the space and allows you to see things with a clearer picture. And I think a lot of people are missing that nowadays. I talked about Jesus being a lot more relational in nature. Once you start having that relational aspect in your own life, I feel like Jesus naturally shows up in that space.
Yeah.
You're able to see things a little clearer through the eyes of, Jesus' teachings. Even if you don't know them yourself, I feel like it just naturally kind of comes upon you. So.
Yeah. Even what Kenton said about, Jesus was given all authority on earth, mm-hmm. that should be empowering in a Jesus way, where when the disciples were imprisoned, they knew that they had Jesus with them, and that was enough for them. They didn't need to be the people who were in charge of the prison, mm-hmm. That's not how they saw it. They, that should be empowering to believers to know that God is powerful, and God mm-hmm. does love people. It's both. It's not, he doesn't need me to have the power for him.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense. I don't know if that was a good point, but yeah.
No, I think it's it needs to be said and everything. I wonder if we should move on a little bit. I did want to give a little bit more reason as to why we think Christian nationalism is bad for society, since this is kind of a react video for based on that video specifically about that topic. If you don't mind, I kind of want to jump into some foreign affairs and talking about immigrants and all that. So one of the things that I didn't actually hear brought up within this debate was Trump's cabinet, everything along that, the stance on foreign affairs and war and everything outside of the country, not domestic, but foreign. The majority of Trump's base and people he appointed within his cabinet, majority of Trump's base, so his supporters, the people that voted for him, they think of him as an anti-war leader. But Trump does surround himself with neocon war hawks. The green light has been given to Netanyahu to finish the job in Palestine. Has been said. Iran is talked about as the greatest threat that needs to be destroyed. And all these things this rhetoric that fuels the industrial weapons complex, the war machine lines its pockets, while funneling American tax dollars into a system that brings only death and destruction through the world. And then you got to also think about the cobalt mining in the countries like
Congo.
What's his plan regarding all that? He hasn't actually come out and said anything about that. But he has put Musk in a governmental position in his own Department of Government Efficiency, which is also ironically named Doge, just like his Bitcoin. Someone who benefits directly off the backs of cheap labor hires and industrial colonialism. Also, under the policies of Trump Project 2025, the U.S. military will be turned on its citizens under the guise of removing the criminals, so quote unquote criminals, and those who violate their visas. But it doesn't seem to have an end stage. They're talking about deporting 15 million people which is a considerable amount. And then that's nearly going to be $1 trillion project on its own. So let alone the economic impact that will have down the road. Immigrants, both legal and illegal, come to America for a variety of reasons, and many take on low-paying jobs that many natural-born citizens don't want to do themselves. So who will fill that void when the demographic is removed? So, the immigrants that are in the strawberry fields in California, they're picking strawberries. Who's going to do that? Who's going to be, doing all these low-paying jobs? Immigrants and undocumented workers also pay an obscene amount of money into the tax base. Without them, it would shrink the GDP by almost $2 trillion a year through independent estimates. Social Security will also get hit hard. Visa workers pay into a system that they'll never benefit from. That's one of the things that is never said in a right-wing media, is that it's always brought out that they are benefiting from our system through the Social Security. And of course, these workers will stop coming in because they won't want to deal with the looming threat of being deported and the hassle of being a foreigner. There will be a supply shocks cascading at every level. I should make a note that there is a statistic about violence toward minors. So if you're sensitive to this, please skip forward 30 seconds or maybe a minute or so. And Sarah, are you okay if I share this? Yeah. All right. So the administration has stated that immigrants aren't safe at schools or public places and will be taken away by the military. I should remind everybody that any attempt to deport or separate families will ultimately lead to mass child abuse. To give a quick statistic, between 2014 and 2018, the Office of Refugee Resettlement received 4,556 allegations of sexual assault or harassment of unaccompanied minors in U.S. custody. I believe this really is a bipartisan issue that we should all agree on, that violence towards minors is bad. Violence toward children, to be more specifically. This number will most certainly go up under the banner of a Christian nationalist project with the 15 million people that they're projecting to deport. So, I mean, I would see everything that I've said so far as a big minus to Christian nationalism and the policies that are being pushed. If you don't mind, I'm gonna say one more here. Also, the CBO, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, projects that the immigrants that were admitted into the country under the Biden administration alone, they will decrease the federal deficit by about $1 trillion over the next 10 years because of all the productive work that they do and the fact that they actually don't receive a lot of the benefits because they aren't of legal status. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on immigration or immigrants, both legal and not legal. I did trim a couple clips from Tim himself from other episodes. So if you want to play that, otherwise I would love to hear your thoughts first before we jump into that.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you said it, so I'm going to say it again in case you missed it. But if you said it and I just missed it, I apologize. But just the immigrants are half as likely to commit violent crimes than native-born citizens. And yes. And then you already did say they do contribute more.
No, I don't know if I said that actually, but yeah, thanks. If I did, Thanks for reiterating it. If I didn't, thank you for saying it because it needs to be said.
Yes, and I mean that seems like a hard thing if you haven't heard that before. I've actually had to repeat that statistic to people, and that's from a study from that they did in Texas because I think from 2012 to 2016 they did this study, or it might have been 2018. It started in 2012 and I think it ended in 2018, but I could be wrong. And they basically, everybody that gets pulled over or commits a crime, they have to ask you, are you documented or undocumented, or are you a citizen? And so they went, every person in Texas has that process when you're arrested for something. And so that statistic comes from a respected study that did that. So anyway.
Good on. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, no problem. We'll play the clip.
Yeah, let's go ahead and play the clip. So these clips are Tim just talking about immigrants and some of the rhetoric and policies that are projected to take place. So yeah, if you want to find those, we can go and play those.
You got it.
So Now they want to denaturalize immigrants to get them out of the country. Think about that. It's step by step by step. Don't worry, we're just here for the criminal undocumented immigrants. Don't worry, we're just here for the immigrants who we don't think are here legally, even though they are. Hey, don't worry. Now we're going to denaturalize immigrants who were born here and naturalized as citizens because they were born in American soil, to kick them out. Seriously?
Yeah.
And this one, I think, is another good example of just like where the far right is going that just put Trump in power. William Wolf, who used to be part of the Trump administration in 2016, he was a former administrative official there. He tweeted this: "Who is an American? That might be one of the hardest questions for our current generation to answer well, though it didn't used to be like that. It's also one of the most important. In order to figure out where we want to go as a nation, we need to know who we are as a people." And then he recommends a book. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a second. Wait, why is this one of the hardest questions to answer? I thought an American, in his worldview, was someone who's here legally. So is it more complicated than that? So what else are we defining who an American is and is not? So it's not about legal or undocumented immigrants. That's not what this is about. That's simply the Trojan horse for what's going on inside of it, which is really, you have to have a certain set of right belief, maybe look a certain way, assimilate the right way, and then we dub you an American. And this is why Trump can also say publicly and still get elected, I'm concerned about the enemy from within. Who are the enemies from within? I thought we're all Americans. I thought if we have a social security number, I thought that we are, legal Americans. But in this world, that's not how it breaks down.
Yeah.
So do you have any thoughts about the denaturalization that they're talking about?
First, I wanted to say on that topic that Stephen Miller isn't just a random Republican. He is appointed to be Trump's Homeland Security advisor, according to NPR. I had to Google it because I couldn't remember which cabinet position he had appointed him to. And he was in the first Trump administration, and he's kind of always been anti-immigration to a point that seems kind of wonder what motivates this guy to be so anti this. Like, is there a personal vendetta? I think I've talked to family and friends, who didn't vote the same as me, and I've heard, they're not gonna do mass deportations. And my thought on it was, a lot of the YouTubers I follow played me Trump's rallies night after night after night, and that's kind of what he promised people. And I would love for him to break that promise. That would be great if he was just like, oh, that's a lot of work, we shouldn't do that. But if he follows through on what he said he would do, it's all the stuff Tim's talking about, Tim Whitaker's saying in this video. I would love for it to not happen, because I know a lot of good people that are immigrants who have, been naturalized citizens. And I think it's a really slippery slope to othering people in whatever group you want, like Tim was saying, which is really dangerous.
Yeah, and the guy that you were talking about, was he one of the ones that actually helped pen the Project 2025? I know there's a number of people within Trump's administration that are part of the process of penning the Project 2025. I couldn't remember if Stephen Miller is one of them or not.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think he's probably, I would think, I would definitely check. I'm Googling it now.
Mm-hmm.
I know Russ Vogt is one that he's appointed. He was featured in videos produced by the Heritage Foundation promoting Project 2025.
Heritage Foundation, yeah. So Heritage Foundation is the one that did create the
Yes.
Project 2025. So that makes sense then.
And he's the head of the conservative legal activist group America First Legal. And his strange ads on Twitter, I've always gotten of him being like, "Stop, don't scroll," So that's him. It makes sense he'd promote it because it matches a lot of his worldviews.
Yeah. All right. So I want to talk about the criminalization of homelessness. So based on what I've been seeing, I would expect to see, and of course, this is all, time will tell, but I would expect to see homelessness or homeless people put into camps. But when I say that, the government has already sanctioned homeless encampments by the Invisible People NGO and are sold as a solution by the media. But honestly, it is a very ominous solution at that. It has been touted as an open-air prison, And homeless people who refuse to stay at these encampments are likely to be arrested and put in an actual prison. And if you know anything about the prison system in America, it's a very major money-making machine. It exploits profits over essentially free labor. So with the development of the cop cities in just about every single state, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a record amount of people arrested over these next couple of years, which will fill many of America's empty prisons. And if you don't know anything about America's empty prisons, you should read up on that as well. We as a nation could literally provide housing for every single person in America based on how much tax revenue we bring in and how much we have for projects and stuff like this. But with the Supreme Court's ruling several months ago with the criminalization of being homeless is honestly bringing that in the wrong direction. Bernie Sanders has been speaking out against this, that we cannot address homelessness without addressing the financial causes of what causes homelessness. One thing that was omitted from the conversation regarding Trump is that 40% of single-family homes are owned by Blackstone, which is like an umbrella for other real estate companies, and they are actually under the umbrella of BlackRock. If you've heard anything about BlackRock, there's a lot of conspiracy theorists that talk about BlackRock, but honestly, BlackRock is one of those big financial institutions that is an umbrella over a great many companies here in America.
There was a mass buyout. Well, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a mass buyout by Blackstone and mass buyout, and nobody is addressing that, and Trump won't address it either. It's in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which, if you know what the Sherman Antitrust Act, it's basically that no company or no entity can have a monopoly
on the
area
market
that they operate within. Nearly half of all Americans' homes are owned by one corporation, which creates a housing shortage that causes the prices to go up. You compound that with the interest or the increase of interest rates, and it's the perfect storm for homelessness. But people like Trump don't want to speak up because honestly, I think that they are that things like entities like BlackRock are they're quote unquote masters. They kind of have them kind of in their grip. So
yeah,
that's kind of my whole take on that.
About that Supreme Court ruling. You want to tell me more about that? Yeah, I just hadn't heard of it. I will say the growing income inequality, wealth inequality is a huge thing that I've been reading up on, and mostly watching YouTube videos of this guy. There's this British guy that's like a trader, and that's like his main message is talking about how housing is being owned by the super wealthy, and then more and more people are getting poorer and poorer generationally. Less and less of your house is owned by you than like your parents own their parents.
So the ruling that I mentioned, it wasn't like straight out like if there's a homeless person on the street that it criminalized them just for being there. Basically, basically the Supreme Court on Friday, it talks about June's article is in June 28th, so whatever the Friday before that was, that it upheld ordinances in a Southwest Oregon city that prohibit people who are homeless from using blankets, pillows, or cardboard boxes for protection from the elements while sleeping within city limits. Which, if you're homeless, you're not going to just sleep in the snow. I mean,
was that the Oregon Supreme Court or just the Supreme Court?
This article is talking about the Supreme Court held up ordinances in Southwest Oregon City. So
either way, terrible policy. That sounds a lot like not allowing people to bring water while they go vote and wait in line to vote.
So, okay, here we go. I found another one. It says the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that cities can ban people from sleeping and camping in public spaces. So it's the U.S. Supreme Court that did this, yeah.
Wow.
It was the justices in a 6-3 decision, along with ideological lines, overturned lower court rulings. So yeah, it's people sleeping outside. So if they're caught sleeping outside by police, it's a criminal act that can be arrested by it.
Wow. That's wild.
Yeah, super wild. It kind of, I mean, you think, of course, going back to Jesus' teachings about
taking care of the poor, taking care of people that are in need.
Yeah, taking care of people that are in need, that basically that can't repay you. moving on with homosexuality, I kind of blocked all these out. So I'll jump into the what's known as the clobber passages. So there are only 6 passages, and 7 if you include Jude, in the entire Bible that address homosexuality. Only 0.05% of all scripture out of 31,000 verses total. And compare that to 550 passages about love and 172 about justice. These are known as the clobber passages, like I talked about. Those are Genesis 19, 1 through 11, which is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Jude 1:7 references Sodom and Gomorrah with the Greek term that translates to pursuing strange flesh. Leviticus 18:22, the labeling of homosexuality as abomination. Leviticus 20:13, it's the same thing. It's right around there. Romans 1:27, Paul's words about men exchanging natural and unnatural relations, and 1 Corinthians 6:9, which is Paul's condemnation of the Greek term arsenekotai, and 1 Timothy 1:9 through 10, Paul's condemnation of the Greek term malachi. So the term homosexual wasn't even always translated that way in the Bible. First, you had the Latin Vulgate in 383, which was the term. Let me see if I don't just massacre this. Masculorum concubitoris, so basically male concubines. The Luther Bible in 1534, it's oh boy, this is German. Die Nabenschande is boy violators. The Geneva Bible in 1587, it was buggers, early word for anal intercourse. And then King James Version, 1607, abusers of themselves with mankind. The Wesley's New Testament in 1755, which is sodomites. And then, of course, Revised Standard Version in 1946, which you have that whole film that's based off of which they translated as homosexuals. So that's where you actually see the first word of the first use of homosexuals in the Bible. Wow. So when you get to, I'm just going to go over the Sodom and Gomorrah real quick, just one little line. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah was not condemning homosexuality, but rather a lack of hospitality and sexual exploitation. There's plenty of resources to go over this, but I'm just going to leave it at that. If we look at Paul's writings in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, we see the word arsenekotai, which often translated as homosexuals, which is a compound word combining 2 Greek words, arsenos, male, and koite, bed, with the euphemism of sex. So it's translated to male bedders. The word is coined by Paul and only shows up in these 2 verses, but it is in reference to Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13. Contextually, it implies idolatry and possibly a difference in age. In the Greco-Roman world at the time these passages were written, the practice, and by passages written, I'm talking about with 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy with Paul, the practice of pederasty, which was an erotic relationship between an older man and a younger boy, was prevalent, normalized, and objectively predatory. Theologians have suggested that Paul was referring to pederasty since it was a ubiquitous form of homosexuality at the time and would have been the first harmful practice people would have thought of when using a term like male bedder. All this to say, this should tell you that the subject isn't as black and white as it's often made out to be. So when someone like, Kenton, I'm just going to use him as an example, but I've heard this, numerous times, and I'm sure you have, that how he desires gay people to go away and often even be punished for, just being gay, and, someone being a lesbian or someone being trans, even in, in certain circles and whatnot. I personally find that stance very ignorant and lacking in openness of understanding. And when I say ignorant, I'm not saying stupid. I'm saying ignorant that they're only looking at one side of things. They're only looking at the side that they've been taught all their lives, the side that is being taught within the church, and the side that is a very straightforward reading of the Bible. And if you look at, how the Bible is translated those words, if you're taking a very literal approach to the Bible, of course you're going to take it that way. So, but if you actually look into it a little deeper and try to put yourself into the times of when it was written, and also what was going on within those times, it does make it a lot more nuanced and not as clear cut as making homosexuality as an abomination sort of thing. So that's kind of what I want to say about that. And
yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of room for people to take things very strongly when there's only a few verses. And example I've been saying lately is like there's a verse where Jesus talks about if you are divorced from your spouse and you remarry, you are committing adultery or something like that. And I'm like, there are a lot of people in my church that are remarried that I do not believe are committing adultery right now, right? Like life is messy. Life is complicated things. And I think it's easy to remove nuance when it makes you uncomfortable or when it doesn't fit mold that you follow. I also just think just what you're saying, it might not be as black and white as some people make it out to be. I love when things are, yes, right and wrong. This is easy to understand. I love when things are easy to understand and they're black and white. I think most of society loves certainty. But I think people have confused certainty with faith. Like the name it and claim it movements where they, you can't say you're sick or you can't say you're hurt. You have to just say you're healed and things like that. It's easy to be certain as a replacement of faith. Mm-hmm. I think it takes real faith to say, I don't know sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I think Christianity needs more of, I don't know.
It's healthy to know how to say, I don't know. To admit when you've been wrong. Admit when you've led people astray. Admit when, people show you a better side, a better way of doing things, and admit that you may not have seen, the whole picture. So, yeah. And, it's as like when I hear arguments about all this kind of stuff that we're talking about, it's based, a lot of it's based on the, especially apologetics, fundamentalism, apologetics. It's that, if you can prove even that there's a sliver of possibility that my narrative is right, despite if it's against all odds and it's more likely that it's something else or it's not that at all, then I can presuppose the existence of my narrative to be true. And it's just such I'm losing my words. I don't know if you have a word for it, but
it's like a weak framework.
It's a weak framework. And I don't know if I ever want to live like that. I'm a very skeptical person, and I think I've become a very skeptical person. I haven't always been this way, but it's one of those things, like the more you learn, the more you realize that you don't know as much as you did.
Yes.
It's like there's this fear of learning too much that will take apart this comfortable place that people are in. Everything's already figured out.
It's safe uncertainty.
All this, that they want someone to kind of be the parent figure, I guess. And, God is their parent, like, especially within Christian circles, God is that parent figure. And it's easier to go along with what you've been told. So if you read the Bible literally, it's easier to take that as truth and not question it if that's kind of what you're seeking. When especially apologetics and fundamentalists are looking at the Bible, they view it as they want to view the whole picture, and they almost kind of try to make the Bible as like the cover art on like a puzzle box.
Right.
and then when you take it out, you put all the pieces together. When more, it's like a box of Legos, and not just a box of Legos, but it's like hundreds of different sets of Legos. So you get like Star Wars, you get Harry Potter, you get like all these different Lego sets. But not even just that, it's on top of that you get like random assorted Legos that came from like your neighbor's kids, or like your older brother that bought like a Lego set sometime, and then they lost half the pieces and they just threw it in a box. So you get all that, and that's actually a more representation of what the Bible is. You get, the Bible was written by numerous people on earth, and you get this whole idea of the Bible as univocal. When you start to study the Bible, you see that there are a lot of contradictory ideas that people bring up in the Bible. Even about God is very contradictory in some of the parts of the Bible, where you get one thing about God in one part of the Bible, and then you get another part that's like, oh, that's kind of makes you question a little bit, like doesn't that kind of run contradictory to this other part that I've read a little earlier? And so it's a very messy thing to go through, and once you start kind of opening these ideas up, you kind of break free from some of that what Tim puts it as, the basement of fundamentalism. So yeah.
I'm grateful the Bible school I went through was just a small program like my pastors did, and so I wasn't really exposed to this fundamentalist ideology and like way of thought. I don't know if I would have been able to take it. I think the intellectualism of the Bible is a little bit overwhelming. The way people do that, I much prefer Tim Mackey being like, here's what the Hebrew is, like I prefer that, cartoons. But the thing I was going to say, just one more thing on this topic, is like, do you remember when Lauren Daigle was on Ellen, and then like Christians were like, okay, well, the Christian world was like, well, Lauren Daigle, is Ellen DeGeneres going to go to hell because she's gay? And Lauren Daigle was like, I write music. I don't feel qualified to answer your question. And it ticked me off because all these people were outraged and like boycotting Lauren Daigle. And I was just like, if I could just time travel and be there with Lauren Daigle, this is what I would tell her to say. Hi, person with your gotcha question. You are asking the wrong person about if this is a sin or not, or will send someone to hell. If you were saying this in good faith, you would be asking Jesus, not in front of a camera. You would be asking, am I qualified to answer that question? No. As Lauren Daigle, I'm not qualified. But the one who is, the person you say you follow. And we wouldn't be videotaping him to like get him to say something. Like that's so disingenuous. It's such a... And like you don't, like that whole thing to me encapsulated this is a petty culture war type thing, not a rooted in beliefs and like standards and like values. It didn't feel like it was rooted in values. It felt like it was rooted in we're right and other people are wrong. And I think when you mix in the hatred element of the things that this community has had to endure, that makes me as a Christian go, I think I need to stand between the people who are being hateful and between them and the people they're hating on. And I should protect those people because that's what Jesus would do. So that's also what's kind of pushed me towards where I'm at with that, which is it's okay to not know, and it's okay to just not tell people how to live.
That kind of goes, I was talking to somebody last night, about that exact very similar thing, and I said a very similar thing to him. I was like, if there is a marginalized group of people and there is something that could potentially be harmful against them, and even if hypothetically that harmful thing is in the right, it's logical, it's everything like that, I'm still going to side with the marginalized person because I feel like that's what Jesus would do.
Yep. That's how we would treat homeless people. That's how we would treat people who are addicted to drugs, perhaps. I don't know. Just thinking of like, we say that's bad, but like, you're not going to harm these people just because you don't agree with them. That's not Jesus. Jesus doesn't do that.
No. Let's see, I had one thing in here about kind of talking about the moral ritual laws. I don't know. Do you think I should read this?
You can. I think it's interesting. I'm sure a fundamentalist person who's just really into this book stuff would be really into this, but I feel like what you're trying to say there is that he was just like mixing them wherever he wanted. It's kind of, he was
do you mind if we go ahead and play that clip and then I can maybe do my little blurb about it?
I like that. Yeah, sure. It's interpreting scripture through a lens. No.
Which one was it? Let's see here. It was the
threefold division of the law.
Threefold division of the law. That was the one.
All right.
Yeah.
Joy.
But that's the crux, is how do you decide which laws in the Bible? And there are a lot of them. Some could be applicable, some might not be. How do you decide what God's law is when you use that term? Like, what's the definition for that?
Okay, so yeah. What I'm going to state is, and I'm sure you're familiar, if you're familiar with guys like Joel Webb and Doug Wilson, Stephen Wolfe, some of these guys on the Reformed Christian Nationalist side, are you familiar with the threefold division of the law?
You mean like ceremonial,
civil, and moral, right?
Yeah, I'm very familiar.
And so what I would say is, when we're talking about God's law, and I don't have the citation in front of me, but we look at the book of Hebrews, the book of Hebrews is going to tell us that the ceremonial law of God specifically has been totally abrogated, right? And so the way that the confession that I subscribe to, the 1689 confession, is going to say is that we should obey and subscribe to, or we are not beholden to God's law other than the general equity of that law. So what we are going to, or what I advocate for as a Christian nationalist, is that the moral law of God is universal, right? The Ten Commandments, the summary law of the moral law, or the summary of the moral law written in the Ten Commandments, is a universal principle. Romans chapter 2 tells us that the moral law of God is written on the hearts of men. And so based on that moral law, we extrapolate and exegete all the other laws that God has given and define them based on how they've been applied in the Old Testament to that particular people. And we apply that law based on the moral law to our present day. Does that make sense?
All right.
Okay, so Kenton talks about how the moral and the ceremonial laws, after Tim brings it up, and I like, Tim actually goes into a little bit more of like, okay, he pushes it in, and what laws actually do, follow along with this. What are the laws that we are to adhere to? And the argument is that Jesus only fulfilled the ceremonial laws, so we're only beholden to the moral laws. In Judaism, moral laws are viewed as universal laws. So like he was talking about, written on our hearts, applicable to all humanity. The holiness codes were explicitly designed to separate Israel from its surrounding nations. This necessarily means that these laws aren't applicable to everyone. If the laws were not being followed by surrounding nations, this means they wouldn't qualify as moral laws. So the separation of moral and ceremonial laws by evangelicals honestly is just lazy. And it's a way of picking and choosing verses that justify the rules they want to enforce and those they wish to ignore. And I believe Tim actually brings this up in when he's pushing back and everything like that too, in a further clip. So if you do want to see some of this banter back and forth, honestly, everyone listening to this, you should go and check it out.
It was a really good debate.
It was. Like I said, it was very enjoyable to watch. Do you have any thoughts on this at all?
So I'm just trying to understand kind of what they're saying. People, Kenton, and people who believe like Kenton. He's saying that Jesus fulfilled the.
So by dying on the cross. So.
But which ones are the ones the.
So it was the moral, the ceremonial, and
civil. Okay, sorry.
Civil.
So, but what I think you're saying, and I'm just trying to learn. Like I honestly haven't heard this before. That the civil laws, Jesus fulfilled those, so we don't have to worry about keeping them. Is that
it's
what they're saying?
Ceremonial and civil is what Jesus covers.
Okay.
With his blood dying on the
He
cross
doesn't
for our
cover
sins.
all the law.
So it's just the moral laws that he doesn't cover, and those are the ones that that Christian nationalists declare as what they want to instill as, you know, what the nation is all about. And, you know, as, you know, ruling the nation from the 7 mountaintops, these moral laws are going to be our guide stones.
I always thought like the ceremonial and the moral kind of mix it's pretty hard to tell them apart. Obviously the ceremonial is like things that they needed to do to stay alive, right? Like not eating red meat and like things like that, things that were going to kill off basically them before Jesus could be born.
And I think those are covered by Jesus' coming and dying.
I think it's crazy. I'm not trying to alienate people, but I've never heard that he didn't cover all of the sins.
Yeah.
That's a weird thing to say. I've just never heard that. But again, I haven't been in these kind of circles for this type of reformed stuff. I just haven't. So,
and this just goes into like the interpretation, the translations, the you know, the logic behind the different things that we see in the Bible and practice in our lives. You know, like we were talking about, there's 45,000 different denominations of Christianity in the world, and you know, with each denomination, there might be small differences, but there's differences, and those are things that we all adhere to. And there's good, valid arguments for a lot of stuff in the Bible. And so like what you're talking about, like you always grew up that Jesus didn't cover all of our sins. You know, there's people that believe that he covered all the sins. There's people that believe that everything in the Old Testament has been covered, you know, whether it be moral, civil, or ceremonial. There's people that believe that only moral codes aren't covered by Jesus' blood. So
I've never heard that. That's crazy.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different interpretation on this, and it's a very messy, very nuanced discussion and debate topic and everything that you could really get into. So to say that there's one way to do it, it's a very dangerous path to go down. So yeah, definitely.
I grew up thinking like Catholics not real Christians, you know, like and now I'm like, that seems overly simplistic to just assume I know what denominations are best. I went to a Baptist high school, and it like all growing up, and I would just be mad at Baptists all day long, just like mad at this chapel, but mostly coming from the point of we should be preaching our messages to, like, the harshest message we have should be to our own people, not to non-believers. And it felt like a lot of times the messages were the harshest towards non-believers. And my friend had reminded me of a quote my pastor had said, where he was like, to expect people who say they don't believe what we believe to follow what we believe is like going into a graveyard and expecting them to be dancing. And I was like, that's an interesting thing. You know, I don't know how I feel about that quote now, but like, yeah, like expecting others to just conform to our way of life because it's superior that is a really slippery slope. So,
well, I wonder if we should bring this up to a close. Now, the whole debate is Christian nationalism good for society? I think time will tell. If our nation does become a theocracy, which Christian nationalism does want to move in that direction, if we do become a theocracy, I'm wondering if we will see, you know, the fruitfulness of it, or if we're going to see a lot of damnation out of it. And my question is, and I don't know if you saw this, when Trump takes office and Christian nationalism becomes the thing, and they start implementing everything that Project 25 has you know, written in it, and the rights of everyone, including those who voted for him or not, become impacted, whether positively or negatively. And looking at primarily the negative impacts of it, if that were to happen, you know, hypothetically, do you think they would eat crow and repent? I don't know what your idea on that is, or how you think.
I think definitely the beliefs of Christian nationalism, like its popularity, is a spectrum, right? And I wonder how many people would be like Kenton and say, that's what I am. That's what I believe. That's what I, advocate for. I definitely think there are people who voted for Trump that when you bring up the idea of Christian nationalism to make people live like us based on our beliefs, a lot of people would disagree. And I hope that that's the majority. I don't know, but a lot of people that I brought it up to, even if they voted differently than me, are like, that's not how I think our country should be run. So the extreme people like Kenton, I don't know if he would. I think he's pretty convinced his way is the right way. It's a great question. And just the merging of Christian and American identities it mirrors other times in history, like the Nazis, unfortunately. I'm not saying, like we said earlier, Christian nationalists don't equal Nazis, but that's what happened during that time in Germany. Is to be a German is to be a Lutheran, and to be a Lutheran is to be a German, and you can't be Jewish, and other religions either. So that's, I think, the danger there, and that's why we want to have the podcast, to talk about the dangers of it and hopefully warn people and hopefully say we're open to talking to you about it. That would be helpful to keep the dialogue going.
And we should also say that we hope, honest to God, that we are wrong in all this. Honestly, I would be happy to say I was wrong about everything I've said. Like, if good things come out of it, awesome. Like, I would love that. So
if the next 4 years is great, I'm all for it. You know what I mean? Like, I want America to do well. I want the people who live here to be safe and to do well. We're a nation built on the idea of religious freedom, and I hope that we can hold that freedom more precious instead of adhering to this ideology. So.
True that. All right, Sarah. I'm going to go ahead and sign us out here. This has been a very long conversation.
Sorry.
No, it's all right. I'm going to go ahead and sign us out here. This has been a very long conversation. I may even split this up into 2 episodes. But Sarah, thank you so much for coming out and talking on this subject. I would love to do another conversation with you
thanks for having
in
me.
the future. And maybe we can get your friend out here again too and do that. So thank you again. And everyone, see you in the next episode.
That's it for today's episode of Grub and Grace. Thanks for joining us on this discussion of Is Christian Nationalism Good for Society? I'd like to give a big thank you for Sarah for joining me on this. I really appreciated her coming out to talk on this topic, and I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure she did too. Keep your eye out for the next episode, and as always, stay curious, keep an open mind, and celebrate the traditions that bring us all together.